Welcome back to Dark Side of the Mic. It's been a wee while since I did a DIY project, and thinking about how much I like the sound of the Beyerdynamic MPC 65 boundary mic when you get it up close and at the right height, that got me thinking about whether I could transplant that capsule and board into a broadcaster style end address microphone for podcasts. And well, this is the result of that. Just a recap on the MPC65 then. It's a boundary mic that comes in a variety of connections. Now the ones I have, and I have 3 of these, come with 2-meter XLR cables that are hardwired into the mic. They're always popping up on eBay for about $30 to $40, sometimes even less than that, and although they might look like utter trash, it's the inner components that we're after here that I think are really quite good. Now the XLR versions are probably the easiest to work with, since all you need to do is cut the XLR cable to length, then solder the cable into a new XLR plug. Some of the other versions with plug connections will require you to solder longer wires onto the circuit board and then onto the XLR plug. Now that's not rocket science either, but it's more to do, and it will be more to do for some of you and something to be aware of. The XLR versions of the mic that I have run off 48 volts of phantom power, and the electric condenser capsule is fixed to a very small preamp circuit board, so when you open up the mic it's just a case of removing the entire board and the cable. I'll put some pictures on the website of some of this process, but it's fairly obvious what you need to do once you open up the mic. And to do that, there are, surprise surprise, 4 screws on the back. But if you really need to be told that, please do not attempt this project at all, and carefully and slowly step away from that soldering iron. And for most of you who are not familiar with the previous mods we've done on this channel, our transplant recipient body will be, as ever, the 743 microphone kit from Aliexpress, which you can now buy for about $10 delivered. Links are on the website for that. They always have millions of them in stock. I don't think they'll ever run out, and I think I'm probably the only one that buys them. In terms of mounting the mic into the broadcast style body then, I've just used a silver mounting bracket that comes with the kit, and I've stuck the circuit board onto that with a plank of fairly firm sticky back foam strip. There's a little bit of movement there, but the foam itself acts as a kind of proprietary shock mount, high tech, and it gets the mic capsule in the position where I want it to be, which is just slightly lower than dead center in the mic. Okay, so now that we've heard the mic for a little while, we'll run through some tests and things to be aware of. Firstly, let's talk about self-noise, and traditionally electric condenser capsules haven't been the best when it comes to self-noise, and this capsule is rated at 25 dBA, which is pretty noisy. However, let's do a practical noise floor test just now. I have the mic connected to my Antelope Audio Zen Go with the gain at 35 dB to get the levels peaking at about -12. It's a fairly quiet weekend day here, my space here is treated, and we'll try and get a moment of silence where we don't hear any traffic noise. I'll put up the noise figures on screen with the audio normalised to -23 LUFS. In terms of the polar pattern then, this has a semi-cardioid response, so it's wider than your standard cardioid. And if we were to do an off-axis rejection test just now, you'll get a sense of that. So at the moment I'm right on the mic and this is how it sounds. And if we turn it to 45 degrees, this is how it sounds from 45 degrees, and you get pretty much a full response, maybe a little bit less low end, but still very usable. And if we turn it to 90 degrees, it starts to fall off quite considerably, but it's still very clear. And at 180 degrees now, it falls off even more. So as we move back to the front of the mic again, that's something to be aware of in a live discussion podcast situation, for example. Say you're concerned about mic bleed from one contributor to another, that's something you would have to think about. But I don't think this example or this mic is much worse than most large diaphragm condenser mics in terms of picking up exterior noise. So I guess that's a judgment call you have to make in terms of who and where you're recording. Now, the frequency response is probably the best thing about this Beyerdynamic capsule. It's predominantly flat, but with a very slight and broad presence boost in the low and the high end. Maybe about 2 dB each end, I'd say. As such, it really avoids sounding overly sibilant or piercing, but it still retains a lovely warmth in the low end that I think is really quite good. it's pretty much a fairly punchy broadcast radio sound out the box. But let's do some comparisons with other mics and we'll wrap up this recording. And first up is the Lewitt MTP 740CM. Now this is a little bit of an unusual handheld condenser mic in that it has a 2.5cm capsule inside, so pretty much a large diaphragm condenser capsule. It has a fairly big punchy sound, but it is a much more expensive mic at about $300 to $400 when it came out. So there's a really big price difference there. And in terms of the gain, I've had to increase my gain to 40 dB in order to reach equivalent level. This is how it sounds. So let me know what you think. Is this comparable to the modified Beyerdynamic? And next up we have the SE Electronics X1S. Now this, I think, for me is the greatest deal on the planet for a large diaphragm condenser mic on a budget. I think it sounds absolutely fantastic. Doesn't sound overly sibilant and has a fair bit of warmth in the low end. I don't think the Beyerdynamic will be able to compete with this large diaphragm capsule in terms of articulation and general sound, but it'd be good to add this in here for reference just to get a sense of the differences between the different mics. And next up we have the Rode M2. Now this is another handheld condenser mic that uses an electric condenser capsule. So a small capsule very similar to the Beyerdynamics one. And this is how this one sounds. I think this is an excellent mic as a beginner podcast mic because it has excellent off-axis rejection and is really very idiot-proof to use. So a really good beginner podcast mic, and it's one that I recommend. And next up we have the SE Electronics V7. Now this is possibly my favourite dynamic mic that you can buy, certainly on a budget. I don't think there's anything better than this in terms of dynamics. This is how this one sounds though. I've got my gain at 50 dB in order to hit negative 12 dB. And I think this is an excellent podcast mic. Certainly for anyone starting out, this is what you should buy. And continuing with this theme of dynamic mics, we've moved over now to the Neumann BCM 705. Now this is a fairly premium dynamic mic. I think it goes for about $500-600 brand new, and it's the only dynamic mic that Neumann actually make. But how does it compare certainly to the V7, which just came before it, and how does it compare to the modified Beyerdynamic? What sound do you like the best, and what would you spend your money on? Next up we have the Line Audio CM4. Now this is a tiny small diaphragm condenser mic that uses an electric condenser capsule, and similarly to the Beyerdynamic capsule, this has a very flat frequency response. I think it's a fantastic sounding mic and really incredible for the size of it and the money. It's only about $100 or so, so an absolute bargain. This is the Line Audio CM4. And next up we have the Shure SM7B. I've increased my gain on the Zen Go to 60 dB. Now this is a fairly familiar sound that everybody knows and loves. So although I don't think it's really comparable with any mic that we've had in the test so far, I think it's useful to include as a reference recording. It really gives us a sense of where we are with the other mics and how they sound. And finally we've moved over to the Mackie EM91-CU. Now this is a small USB microphone that I normally use for mailing out to remote podcast guests. It's really easy for them to set up at home and record themselves either via Riverside or through their phone, for example. It's quite dark in nature and it also uses an electric condenser capsule, and that's why I've included it here. It should be a good comparison to the butchered Beyerdynamic. So as we move on to some final thoughts then, we've switched on some mild EQ and compression for the last part of this recording just to see how we can make this mic sound. I think jumping back and forward between the other mics is always quite revealing, and what you hear the first time is not always the same once you have some context. I don't think this modified Beyerdynamic broadcaster mic sounds as full or has that open sparkle as the large diaphragm mics in this test, but then again that would be a tall order for an electric capsule. Having said that, it's not a million miles away either. It definitely offers a lot of detail and articulation over, say, the Rode M2, and it does feel noticeably smoother than most of the dynamics in this test, with the obvious exception being the SM7B. At times it does seem to creep into sounding a little bit hollow or nasally, but it's nothing too offensive even on my voice. To my ears I think it sounds most alike that little Mackie USB mic, which has a similar dark focus sound that I really like for long listen podcasts. Okay then, so I hope that's been helpful for you, and if you can pick up one of these Beyerdynamic boundary mics for a few pennies, I think this is really quite a simple and inexpensive project to try out. As always, let me know what you think, what was your favourite, and we look forward to hearing from you again next time.